my name is Sophie Karbstein. I'm an intern with the Nuclear Age Peace Foundation, and I'm very excited for the opportunity today to meet and speak with Togzhan Kassenova, a senior fellow with the Project on International Security, Commerce, and Economic Statecraft at the Center for Policy Research, SUNY-Albany, and a non-resident fellow of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. So this summer, I am spending 2 months in Almaty, Kazakhstan, in a Russian immersion program. And one of the first things I did after finding out that I would be going to Kazakhstan was to read Togzhan's incredible book, Atomic Step: How Kazakhstan Gave Up the Bomb. And the book taught me a lot about the anti-nuclear history of Kazakhstan, which not only was home to the lion's share of Soviet nuclear tests, but which upon gaining independence from the Soviet Union, inherited over 1,000 nuclear bombs and became the world's fourth largest nuclear state. And then they proceeded to completely get rid of them. So I'm really thrilled today to welcome Dr. Kassenova to this conversation and to talk to her about her life, her book, the amazing history of Kazakhstan. Thank you so much for speaking with me today.
Thank you, Sophie. It's a pleasure to be recording this with you, and I'm a little bit envious that you are joining from Almaty, Kazakhstan.
So while I was reading your book, I already knew that I would be living in Almaty, Kazakhstan this summer. So I was really heartened by your declaration, the prologue, that Almaty was your first love, and also by your descriptions of your connection to your country and to your father and his work with Kazakh nuclear policy. So I was wondering if you could speak briefly about your upbringing in Kazakhstan and also about how you became interested in issues of nuclear policy, and then how you made your way to the United States.
Thank you. So I was born in Kazakhstan while it was part of the Soviet Union. So my childhood was during the Soviet period, but then while I was in school, the Soviet Union collapsed, and that was a very challenging, interesting, and I think hopeful time for Kazakhstan because it gained independence. When I was young, studying at the university in Kazakhstan, I was already very interested in international relations. My first degree is in IR. And then when I continued with my graduate studies in the United Kingdom, more and more I recognized that I was interested in issues of international security. And so when I reached the stage of choosing a topic for my PhD, that's when I decided that I want to have a career in the nuclear policy world, that I wanted to be in the world of nuclear politics. And there were several reasons for that. I think number one reason is the family I'm coming from. The family of my father is from the region that sadly was affected by Soviet nuclear tests. And so that region holds a special place in my heart, and I care about it. I care about its people. Then also, as you've mentioned, my father was one of the key experts working on Kazakhstan's nuclear policy making during those early years of independence. And so through that connection as well, I had the interest and kind of a mission to continue what my father did during his life. And finally, just being a Kazakh and coming from a country that experienced so much heartache, but also a country that built its national identity around around nuclear disarmament. I thought this nuclear theme was just so important for the country I was coming from that it just felt like a very logical path for me to pursue.
Thank you. So where did the idea for Atomic Step come from, and when did you realize that you wanted to write a book about Kazakhstan's nuclear story?
So the idea, I think, came around maybe roughly 15 years ago. So not at the start of my research path in the nuclear politics initially, and especially during my PhD, I was focused on the United States and Russia. My PhD dissertation was devoted to what's called cooperative threat reduction process. And these are the US-funded programs to reduce nuclear risks in the former Soviet Union, but I focused very much on Russia. But as the time went by, I just felt the need to tell a full story of my own country. And so, yeah, roughly, I think about 15 years ago was when I started thinking about how I can do it. I started collecting material, working in the archives, meeting people. And it was a very long process because writing this book was never part of my job description or any project obligation. It was really something that I was doing for myself, for Kazakhstan, and for the international community. I felt compelled to record the story, to tell the story.
The section of the book that describes like the negotiations between the Kazakhstan and the United States governments is supported by this incredible amount of research from archival policy papers and interviews with diplomats who were part of this. So could you tell us about the process you went through to research and write this book and how long this all took to assemble and process?
So for both the first half of the book, which is more on the Soviet period and the period of nuclear tests, and for the more policy-oriented second half about diplomacy, I relied mostly on archival research and interviews with the participants of the events. It was a very long process, especially the Soviet period took me a long time to research because I'm not a historian, and I didn't live in the 50s or 60s or 40s. And so because I was trying to give a broad introduction to the reader, what Kazakhstan was about, what its history was like, I had to learn a lot of things myself. And so that took really a long time just to get an idea of what was happening during the Soviet period. I would say the second half, the one devoted to diplomacy, it also took years and years, but it was a little bit easier in terms of access and maybe the quality and preciseness of the documents, because I worked more with government documents, transcripts, and just because it was a more modern period, it was a little bit easier to piece together the stories. But all in all, I would say that research and writing took me at least 15 years.
Wow. So you touched on this before, but Atomic Step explains that Kazakhstan leveraged its nuclear weapons to gain international recognition and status in the post-Soviet world and to like construct an identity for itself as an independent nation. So what would you say in response to a statement that Kazakhstan ultimately benefited from its nuclear inheritance, and how can one reconcile the suffering to Kazakh people caused by Soviet nuclear testing with the benefits offered to Kazakhstan by its nuclear inheritance?
It's a fantastic question, and I think it teaches us a lesson that nothing in life is completely black and white, right? That history of countries is usually very complicated and nuanced, and that, the same event that caused so much heartbreak and tragedy, right? The involvement that Kazakhstan didn't choose in the Soviet nuclear weapons project, that really, if I had a choice, I wouldn't want for that to happen to Kazakhstan. But I think it's important, once it was already a fact, right? It was a fact of Kazakhstan's history that Kazakhstan was used by the Soviet military program, that its land was abused, that people suffered. I think it's important that this tragedy was, to the extent possible, turned around. And I'll give you an example. The Soviet nuclear testing site at Semipalatinsk, Would I wish for it to never exist in Kazakhstan? Yes, but if it's a fact of life that it was built. And so I really appreciate that the government of Kazakhstan now is trying to turn it around and use this really unique scientific infrastructure for something that is good, right? For nuclear science or in support of the comprehensive test ban treaty and so on. So, you know, even in very tangible ways, all that infrastructure could be turned around and used for peaceful scientific purposes. In terms of politics, again, I wish, you know, Kazakhstan didn't have the nuclear component to begin with, but I think the fact that people of Kazakhstan could be united in their fight against Soviet nuclear tests, that they felt this agency to push for the closure of the semi-pelagic nuclear test inside. It was an important part of growing as a nation of its own, right? And then when Kazakhstan was faced with the extremely difficult decision of what to do with nuclear inheritance, what to do with all those nuclear weapons, again, it's not a choice I would wish on any country. But if you try to make the best of your situation, I think it was an important test that accelerated Kazakhstan's thinking in terms of what kind of country it wanted to become, right? So in a way, Kazakhstan was pushed into making all these choices and decisions, but I really applaud my native country that when faced with those difficult choices, it could use all of that to build up something that in the end is positive.
I also wanted to mention the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, because Kazakhstan, as you write in your book, was one of the first countries to ratify the treaty, and they did so symbolically on the 70th anniversary of the first Soviet nuclear test on the Kazakh steppe. But today, there are still no nuclear weapon states among the treaty signatories. So are you hopeful about the world's ability to achieve the aims of the TPNW? And do you think that the remarkable story of Kazakhstan's disarmament can play a role in ensuring that we get to a world free of nuclear weapons?
I think while none of countries with nuclear weapons expressed any desire to join the TPNW, I don't think it undermines the treaty, because I find that the value of the treaty is maybe in something else. And for me, this something else is the change in the narrative. It's in this disruption of the nuclear policy discourse, which was always dominated by nuclear powers, and where many countries, many nations didn't have a say. And so for me, that's the most important value of the TPNW. Yes, maybe, those who criticize it, that it doesn't have technical provisions or verification or whatever. It's not, for me, it's not in what I see the main value of the TPNW. For me, the main value is that it gives hope to many people and many nations. It recognizes communities that were dismissed before. And so, yeah, its main value is in changing the conversation and creating this, I think, more hopeful environment. As for the prospects for disarmament, I would be lying if I said that I think it's coming anytime soon, but I do believe in the power of small changes and accumulation of steps. And I think, knowing that something is difficult shouldn't preclude us from working towards it, because we know it's the right thing to do. As for Kazakhstan, I think Kazakhstan has really a unique position as a country in the nuclear field, because it had firsthand experience of what it was like to be part of a nuclear weapons program. It has scientific and technical experience of working on dismantling nuclear weapons programs. And yeah, so there are all those very tangible expertise led contributions that Kazakhstan can make, but also politically, I think in our current situation where there is such a strong divide between nuclear countries, non-nuclear countries, where there is so much tension between disarmament and non-proliferation. I think Kazakhstan is in a unique position in terms of being attuned to both disarmament values, but also being really strong on the non-proliferation side.
Thank you so much again, really, for doing this interview. I really appreciate your thoughtful answers, and I hope we can speak again in the future, maybe even in person.
I hope so too. Thank you, Sophie.